The first crack did not sound like thunder. It sounded like ceremony. The council hall of the Northern Dominion had been built to absorb noise. It was a place where decisions were meant to feel heavy before they ever became dangerous. On that day, the hall was full. Banners marked every lineage that had survived conquest, famine, and time. Alpha sigils hung in ordered sequence, their colors muted by age and tradition. The air smelled faintly of iron and cedar, a remnant of older oaths sworn when dominance still had to be proven with blood instead of protocol. At the center stood Kyle Varon. He did not wear armor. He never did during council. Power that required reinforcement was not power worth displaying. Kyle's presence settled the room without effort. Conversations slowed when he moved. Disputes ended when his attention drifted their way. He was the Alpha King not because he demanded obedience, but because the world around him aligned instinctively when he entered it. For nearly 20 years, Lyra had stood at his side, not behind him, beside. She wore no sigil. No ceremonial markings distinguished her from any other woman in the hall. If a stranger had entered the council chamber that day, they might have mistaken her for an aide, or a messenger, or someone who simply belonged nowhere important enough to name. That mistake would have cost them dearly. Lyra was still when the council was still, moving when the hall required movement. She listened when arguments spiraled and spoke only when the room lost its way entirely. Her voice never rose. It didn't need to. Kyle felt it when she shifted her weight beside him. A subtle awareness, as natural as breath. She had a way of anchoring his attention without touching him, of pulling his focus back when the room grew too loud with ambition. The council had noticed this long ago. They simply chose not to acknowledge it. Uncrowned influence was tolerable. Unnamed power was convenient. A woman without title could be present without becoming precedent, until the matter of succession was forced into the open. The Dominion had been stable for nearly a century, but stability demanded continuity. An heir was not merely tradition, it was insurance against chaos. Pax needed to know where allegiance would flow when the throne was empty. The council had delayed this moment as long as they could, but time was not patient, and neither was fear. Alpha King, one of the elders began, his voice steady but edged with expectation. The matter before us can no longer wait. Kyle inclined his head slightly. He did not look at Lyra. She felt the shift anyway. This was not the first time succession had been discussed, but it was the first time the decision would be made publicly, with witnesses who would carry its weight far beyond these walls. The Dominion requires clarity, another councillor added. An heir ensures continuity, strength, order. The word pressed against Lyra's ribs. She had helped build that order, quietly, invisibly. She had steadied negotiations that would have fractured under pride, redirected conflicts before claws were ever drawn. She had learned, over time, that peace was not maintained through dominance alone, but through restraint. She had assumed, wrongly, that Kyle understood this. The Alpha King stepped forward. The room leaned with him. "My rule is not eternal," Kyle said evenly. "I have never believed it should be." That earned him nods. Approval, respect, he continued. An heir must be chosen based on the Dominion's future, not sentiment. Lyra's gaze remained forward. Her expression did not change. She did not miss the pause. The council waited. Kyle spoke a name. It was not hers. For half a second, the world held its breath. Then relief swept through the hall like a controlled exhale. An heir had been named, young, capable, politically agreeable, someone groomed by lineage and law, someone the council could shape if they needed to. The system had protected itself. Lyra felt the moment settle, not as pain but as clarity. She did not look at Kyle. Not because she was angry, because she understood this was not cruelty, it was choice, and it told her everything she needed to know about where she truly stood. Around her, the council resumed movement. Voices murmured. Formal acknowledgements began. The machinery of order restarted itself satisfied. Lyra stepped back. No announcement followed her movement. No one tracked it. Her absence was not yet loud enough to be noticed. She walked past the banners that had never borne her name, past counselors who had relied on her judgment without ever recognizing its source, past guards who nodded politely, unaware that something essential was leaving with her. Kyle did not turn. He would remember this moment later and realize that was the instant the world began to tilt. Lyra exited the hall and did not stop walking. She did not pack. She did not send messages. She did not leave explanations behind for people who had never asked her to stay. She crossed the threshold between inner keep and outer corridors and felt something loosen, something she had carried for years without naming. The bond did not snap, it stretched. That was the difference. By the time the council finalized its records, Lyra was already beyond the city walls. And by nightfall, the Northern Dominion had begun to feel the quiet. Chapter 2. The Woman Who Learned to Be Absent. Lyra did not vanish the way people expected disappearances to happen. There was no chase, no dramatic severing of bonds, no night ride fueled by heartbreak and fury. She simply stopped being where the world assumed she would always be. At first, no one noticed. The corridors of the Northern Dominion were accustomed to her presence, the way stone is accustomed to shadow. Servants passed rooms that felt oddly unfinished, unable to articulate why. Guards found themselves pausing before issuing commands, the words slipping strangely out of order without her quiet correction to smooth them. Minor things. The kind of disruptions that were easily blamed on fatigue, weather, or tensions surrounding the new air. Kyle noticed them before anyone else. He noticed when trade envoys spoke too quickly, missing the subtle cues that would have once slowed them into reason. When council debates dragged longer, sharpened by ego rather than guided toward resolution. When his own temper, long mastered, began to surface in brief, uncharacteristic flashes, he did not speak Lyra's name, not at first. In the outer territories, Lyra moved without banners or escort. She traded the heavy cloaks of the Dominion for simpler fabric, muted colors that did not announce status or lineage. Her hair, once carefully bound for ceremony, she braided loosely, practical and forgettable. She learned the art of being unseen. This was not the same as hiding. Hiding implied fear. Absence required discipline. She passed through towns where alphas ruled small domains with loud authority and little wisdom, where omegas were spoken over and betas filled the silence with obedience. Lyra listened, watched, learned how power behaved when it was not moderated. It confirmed what she had long suspected. Dominance without balance eventually rotted. She earned coin quietly, mapping trade routes for merchants who didn't realize the value of what she gave them. Settling disputes between border pacts in exchange for safe passage rather than praise. She avoided staying long anywhere she was recognized as capable. Competence attracted expectation. Expectation led to attachment. She was not ready for that. At night she dreamed differently. The bond still existed. She felt it like a distant pressure change before a storm, never sharp, never gone. Sometimes it pulled softly, like a tide testing the shore. Other nights it was heavy, restless, filled with movement that wasn't her own. She learned to sit with it rather than fight it. Absence was not emptiness, it was control reclaimed. Back in the Dominion, the air struggled. He was not weak. He was not cruel. He was simply untempered. The council compensated by tightening rules, more patrols, more proclamations, more displays of force meant to reassure everyone that nothing fundamental had changed. Kyle watched the system overcorrect. He told himself this was normal until the silence grew teeth. It began with a border skirmish that should never have escalated. Then, a trade embargo that could have been avoided with a single properly chosen concession. Then, a rebellion in the southern reaches, small, contained, but loud enough to be noticed. Each problem alone was manageable. Together, they formed a pattern. Kyle called for Lyra during a council meeting without realizing he was doing it. The name landed in the chamber like dropped glass. No one responded. The elder closest to him cleared his throat. She is not present, Alpha King. Kyle stared at the space beside him. Empty. How long? He asked. No one answered immediately. That hesitation told him more than any report ever could. She left the city 3 weeks ago, another counselor said carefully. No formal notice, no record of destination. 3 weeks, the world shifted, not violently, but irrevocably. Kyle dismissed the council early. That alone caused ripples. He moved through the keep with long, purposeful strides, memory rearranging itself with ruthless clarity. He saw every moment Lyra had paused during council debates, every time she had glanced at him instead of speaking, and how he had always understood, except that day. He reached her chambers. They were immaculate. Lyra had never left messes behind, not possessions, not emotions, not unfinished business. It was a habit formed early, sharpened by years of existing in a space that was never truly hers. Only one thing remained, a folded strip of parchment placed deliberately at the center of her desk. No seal, no title, just his name, Kyle. The message was brief. You chose continuity over balance. I am not punishment for that choice. I am its consequence. No farewell, no bitterness. That frightened him more than rage ever could have. The search did not begin immediately. That was Kyle's second mistake. He allowed himself a day to believe she would return on her own terms, the way she always had after disagreements. Calm, thoughtful, already 10 steps ahead of the conversation. He allowed himself to believe absence was temporary. By the time he sent scouts, Lyra was already somewhere else, and she had become something else. She stopped using her name. Names anchored expectation. They pulled questions. She allowed herself to be known instead by function, mediator, cartographer, negotiator. Roles were easier to discard when necessary. In a river city to the east, she dismantled a smuggling ring by convincing its leaders they had already lost. In the mountain passes, she rerouted migration paths without any pack realizing they had been guided. In neutral territories, she taught young wolves how to listen before acting, then left before gratitude could form dependency. She did not build a legend. Legends attracted kings. Instead, she built quiet corrections that allowed systems to survive themselves. And yet, the world still shifted around her. Back in the Dominion, Kyle began to lose patience with restraint. Without Lyra's counterweight, decisions became sharper, faster, less forgiving. Where once he would have negotiated, he now issued ultimatums. Where compromise had once been possible, obedience was now enforced. The council began to fear him. That fear spread. A border alpha resisted conscription. Kyle crushed him in a single night. An allied pack questioned the heir's authority. Kyle answered personally. Word traveled faster than control. The Alpha King was no longer merely powerful, he was becoming relentless. Lyra heard rumors long before names were attached. A king whose temper was fracturing treaties. A ruler whose search parties tore through territories under the guise of order. A bond-mad alpha destabilizing his own domain while claiming to protect it. She felt the bond tighten, not painfully, urgently. For the first time, Lyra considered whether absence alone was enough, because kings, when unbalanced, did not collapse quietly. They tore the world apart, looking for what they had lost. Chapter 3. The King Without Restraint. The first decree was small enough to be mistaken for prudence. It reclassified the outer territories as provisional zones, a bureaucratic phrase that sounded harmless, almost temporary. No banners were changed, no alarms sounded. But the implication was unmistakable. Oversight was no longer shared. Authority flowed in a single direction now, upward, toward Kyle. The council approved it with lowered eyes and tight mouths. They told themselves it would stabilize trade routes, that it would quiet dissent, that Lyra's absence required firmer lines, not softer ones. They did not call it grief, they called it governance. Kyle signed the decree without comment. His hand did not shake, his expression did not harden. He looked, to anyone watching closely, composed, dangerously so. The stillness around him had changed texture. It pressed outward rather than inward, the way pressure does before a fault line slips. The scouts returned with fragments. A woman matching Lyra's description had been seen in the river cities, speaking with merchants and leaving disputes inexplicably resolved. Another report placed her in the western passes, traveling light, never staying more than 2 nights in any settlement. A third claimed she had crossed into neutral territory under a different name. Kyle listened. He asked questions, he issued orders, and then, quietly, he expanded the search. Permits became mandatory for cross-territory travel. Patrols doubled. Checkpoints appeared where none had existed for generations. Wolves, who had never sworn direct fealty to the Dominion, were suddenly asked to confirm allegiance. Resistance rose not because Kyle was cruel, but because he was absolute, and absolutes invited fracture. The air struggled to keep pace. He tried, earnestly, to emulate Kyle's decisiveness. He spoke firmly, punished swiftly, praised publicly, but authority borrowed too early did not sit right on his shoulders. Where Lyra once anticipated tensions before they formed, the air addressed them only after they broke. Mistakes multiplied. A misinterpreted order led to a supply shortage in the south. A delayed response to flooding displaced hundreds. A council vote split narrowly, leaving half the chamber resentful. Kyle stopped attending smaller sessions. He did not withdraw out of arrogance. He withdrew because the conversations grated. They circled problems he could already see through. He had ruled once with balance beside him. Now balance felt like a myth people used to excuse hesitation. He began to intervene directly when a border alpha refused compliance. Kyle did not send envoys. He went himself. The confrontation lasted minutes. No blood was spilled, but the outcome was unmistakable. The alpha knelt not because he was beaten, but because he understood something had shifted. Kyle's presence carried a force that stripped negotiation down to irrelevance. Words spread faster this way. The king without restraint. Some said it with awe. Some said it with fear. No one said it lightly. Lyra felt the consequences before she heard the title. In a market town along the eastern trade road, negotiations she had been guiding quietly for weeks collapsed overnight. Patrols arrived bearing the Dominion's crest, issuing new regulations that nullified local agreements. Merchants scattered. A fragile peace snapped. Lyra stood in the crowd, hood drawn low, and watched confusion ripple outward. This was not what she had intended. Absence had been meant as a correction, a silence loud enough to force reflection. She had believed Kyle would pause, reassess, recalibrate. Instead, he had accelerated. She left the town before dawn. The next region fared no better. Kyle's directives reached even places he had never set foot. Systems Lyra had stabilized were being overwritten with centralized control. Efficiency increased. Resentment calcified. The bond grew heavier, not painful, demanding. It carried images now, not thoughts, but impressions, stone halls echoing without her voice, decisions made too quickly, a temper caught mid-flare and never checked. She realized slowly what she had underestimated. Kael had not chosen an heir because he stopped needing her. He had chosen an heir because he believed he was sparing her the weight of a crown. And now, stripped of her steadying presence, he was shouldering that weight alone and breaking everything beneath it. The turning point came in the form of a refusal. A neutral council, one Lyra had helped establish years ago under Kael's early reign, denied the Dominion's request for oversight. They cited precedent, mutual respect, historic autonomy. Kael read their response once. Then he summoned the war table, the council protested, quietly at first, then more urgently. This council was neutral for a reason. Any show of force would fracture alliances that had survived centuries. Kael listened, he nodded, and then he ordered a demonstration, not an attack, a march. 10,000 wolves moved as one, banners unfurled, armor gleaming, boots striking earth with measured precision. They did not cross borders. They stopped just short, close enough to be unmistakable. The message was clear. Refusal was no longer theoretical. Lyra watched the march from a distant ridge, unseen among shepherd trails and broken stone. She felt the tremor through the ground before she saw the banners, felt the bond surge sharp enough to steal her breath. This was escalation. This was the world beginning to tip. That night, Kael dreamed. He stood in an endless hall, walls lined with doors he had sealed himself. Lyra stood at the far end, not facing him, studying the cracks forming in the floor between them. He called her name. She did not turn. When he woke, the sheets were twisted around his hands. He cancelled the march at dawn. The council was stunned, some relieved, some confused. The damage, however, had already been done. Trust did not retreat as quickly as armies. Kael spent the day alone. He walked the keep without escort, through rooms that still carried Lyra's order. Subtle signs of a mind that had always thought several steps ahead. He stopped in the archive where she used to work late into the night, cross-referencing lineage records and trade pacts. He opened an old map she had annotated years ago. At the corner, in a careful hand, was a note he had once ignored. Centralization breeds speed, balance breeds longevity. He closed the map. For the first time since her departure, something inside him cracked, not loudly, not visibly, but enough to let doubt through. He summoned his fastest courier. "Call off all peripheral searches," he ordered. "Reduce patrol visibility. Return oversight to local councils." The courier hesitated. "My king, the council will see this as correction," Kael said, "not retreat." The orders went out. The world did not immediately stabilize, but it breathed. Far from the Dominion, Lyra felt the pressure ease. Systems she had worried were about to shatter held, barely, but they held. She sat beside a cold river, boots off, letting the water numb her ankles as she thought. Absence had taught her restraint. Kael was learning it the hard way, and now the path between them was changing again. Not toward reunion, toward reckoning. Because a king who had learned what unchecked power cost would not accept balance lightly, he would demand it. Chapter 4. The Return Without Surrender. Lyra did not decide to return in a moment of longing. She decided after watching a system almost fail and realizing restraint alone was no longer enough. The river town of Athens sat at a hinge point between territories. Too small to matter politically, too central to ignore. Under Kael's recent recalibration, patrols had pulled back. Authority had decentralized again. On parchment, it was the correction everyone claimed to want. In practice, it created a vacuum. Power abhorred vacuums. Local alphas began to test boundaries. Merchants raised tariffs overnight. A minor pack leader declared himself protector and started collecting security fees that looked suspiciously like tribute. Nothing overt enough to justify intervention, enough to rot the foundation quietly. Lyra observed for 3 days. On the 4th, she stepped in, not as Lyra of the Dominion, not as the vanished counterweight to a king. She introduced herself as Ilian, a traveler with maps, patience, and an inconvenient habit of asking the right question at the wrong time. She listened first. That, more than any display of dominance, disarmed them. By the end of the week, the self-declared protector had negotiated himself into irrelevance. Merchants had standardized fees out of mutual self-interest. The vacuum closed, not because authority arrived, but because structure emerged organically. It was elegant, it was fragile, and it confirmed what Lyra had come to accept. The world did not need her as a shadow anymore. It needed her as a known variable, but on her terms. The bond stirred differently now, not pulling, aligning. Kyle felt it as a shift in pressure he had learned not to ignore. The reports had changed tone, less fear, less defiance, more coherence. Problems resolving before they escalated. Councils aligning unexpectedly, border disputes dissolving without his intervention. It felt familiar in a way that made his chest ache with recognition. "She's active," he said quietly to no one. The council did not respond. They had learned not to speak when Kyle reached that stillness. He did not issue a search order. That was the difference. Instead, he sent a single message, coded, routed through old channels only Lyra would recognize. It was not a summons. It was an acknowledgement. "I see the corrections. I will not overwrite them." The reply came 2 days later, not in words, in consequence, a disputed valley, one that had resisted Dominion oversight for a century, formally requested mediation under ancient compact. They did not name Lyra. They cited a neutral facilitator whose methods aligned with pre-imperial balance doctrine. Kyle almost smiled. Almost. Lyra crossed back into the Dominion openly. No escort, no announcement. The gates recognized her before the guards did. Word spread anyway, not loudly, not in panic. It moved the way recognition does, subtle, inevitable. Heads turned, voices lowered. Wolves who had never met her felt the shift and didn't know why. She did not go to the keep. She went to the council chamber. They were in session when she entered. Conversation faltered mid-sentence. Chairs scraped softly as councillors rose, not in ceremony but reflex. Lyra inclined her head. "Just enough." "I am not here to resume my former position," she said, voice calm, carrying easily without force. "I am here to define a new one." Kyle entered behind her, not dramatically. He took his place at the head of the chamber and did not sit. The silence stretched, taut, listening. Lyra turned slightly, acknowledging him without yielding ground. "When I left," she continued, "this system believed continuity could substitute balance. When you searched for me, it believed control could substitute trust." She let that land. "Neither holds." A murmur moved through the chamber, unease threaded with understanding. "I will not serve as a corrective shadow," Lyra said, "nor as a silent restraint. I will not disappear to stabilize what refuses to evolve." Her gaze swept the council. "If I remain, it will be as an external axis, autonomous, answerable to consequence rather than command." A councillor found his voice. "You're proposing authority without chain of command." Lyra nodded. "I'm proposing balance without possession." Kyle spoke then. One sentence. "Say what you require, not permission, acknowledgement." Lyra met his gaze fully for the first time since her return. No decrees that override negotiated structures without review, she said. No heir decisions made without impact modeling beyond succession. No mobilization of force without countersignature from an independent balance authority. The room held its breath. These were not requests. They were constraints on a king. Kyle considered them without visible reaction. Then, slowly, he nodded, accepted. The word echoed heavier than any command he had ever issued. Relief rippled through the chamber. Fear followed close behind, not of Kyle, but of the implications. The world had just changed shape again. After the council dispersed, Kyle and Lyra remained alone, not because guards were dismissed, because no one dared linger. "You didn't return for me," Kyle said at last. "No," Lyra agreed, "but you didn't stay away to punish me either." She studied him, really studied him. The line's tension had carved near his eyes. The restraint now layered deliberately over force. He had not softened, he had learned. "I stayed away to become someone who could return without vanishing again," she said. Kyle exhaled, slow, controlled. "And now?" "Now," Lyra said, "we rebuild the world without confusing proximity for possession." The bond settled, not flaring, not tightening, aligning, like two forces agreeing on orbit rather than collision. This was not reconciliation, it was equilibrium. And equilibrium, Lyra knew, was far more dangerous to disrupt than absence ever had been. Chapter 5. The heir who learned to wait. The heir had always been prepared to lead. He had memorized doctrine before he could hunt, learned lineage charts the way other pups learned constellations. He understood ceremony, command tone, symbolic restraint. When Kyle named him heir, no one questioned the logic. It was the timing that unsettled them. Now, after Lyra's return, after the reshaping of authority, after the kingdom had learned that power could be paused without collapsing, the heir found himself standing on ground that no longer behaved the way it used to. For the first time, his future was not guaranteed by inevitability. It had to be earned. The first sign came quietly. He attended a regional council expecting deference. He received courtesy instead, respect measured and conditional. When he spoke, they listened. When Lyra spoke, they adjusted. No one contradicted him. No one deferred automatically either. It was subtle, surgical, and it infuriated him, until he realized anger would only shrink him further. So he began to watch. He observed how Lyra never issued commands, how she framed outcomes instead of orders, how she allowed others to believe solutions were their own, until they were. How Kyle listened now, really listened, with the attention of a man who had learned the cost of speed. The heir realized something with a chill that settled deep in his bones. He had been trained to inherit a throne. They were teaching him how to deserve it. His resentment lasted precisely 1 week. That was how long it took for reality to dismantle pride. A supply corridor collapsed under competing jurisdiction claims. The heir intervened decisively, citing precedent. The ruling was clean, logical, and catastrophically incomplete. The corridor reopened for 2 days, then shut down again under quiet protest. Lyra reviewed his decision without judgment. "You solved the problem you could see," she said, "not the one that would persist." He bristled. "Then why was I taught precedent at all? So you'd know when it was no longer sufficient." She handed him a second file. Trade flows, seasonal migration shifts, labor fatigue projections. Variables he had not accounted for because no one had trained him to see systems as living. "Power that lasts," Lyra continued, "doesn't correct symptoms. It adjusts environments." Kyle said nothing. That silence mattered more than praise ever could have. The heir rewrote his ruling. He did not announce the correction. He credited local councils publicly for insights they had not offered. yet rose to meet. It took longer. The solution was messier. It held. That night he did not sleep, not from anxiety, from recalibration. The world had expanded. Weeks passed. The heir was assigned to observe, not command, a volatile border alliance. His role was explicitly limited. Advisory input only. No override authority. It felt like demotion. It was apprenticeship. He learned how patience disarmed posturing, how silence invited honesty, how waiting created space for truth to surface unpressured. He watched Lyra step back deliberately, allowing him to fail in small, recoverable ways. She did not rescue him. She allowed him to adapt. When conflict finally erupted, brief, sharp, inevitable, it was the heir who negotiated the stand-down. Not through dominance, but through consequence forecasting so precise it scared even him. Kyle read the report twice, then once more. "You waited," he said. "Yes," the heir replied, "because acting sooner would have made it about me." Kyle studied him with an expression the heir had never seen directed his way before. Not evaluation, respect. The council noticed. They began inviting the heir into sessions Lyra did not attend, not because she was excluded, but because the system was testing load-bearing structures. The heir faltered, recovered, learned when to defer and when to stand. His confidence changed shape. It stopped demanding confirmation. The true test came with blood. A distant pack, ancient, proud and stubborn, invoked succession law older than the Dominion itself. They challenged the legitimacy of Kyle's rule, citing Lyra's influence as unlawful dilution of authority. They demanded the heir's presence, alone. Kyle offered to go. Lyra shook her head. "This is his threshold," she said, "not yours." The heir traveled without escort. He stood before wolves who measured worth in scars and lineage. They provoked him, tested his temper, questioned his proximity to Lyra openly, crudely. He listened. Then he spoke, not defensively, not forcefully. He outlined what the Dominion had become, what had been lost before it was found again, what power looked like when it mistook speed for strength. "I am not here to demand allegiance," he said. "I'm here to explain why you'll choose it anyway." They did not submit that night, but they did not challenge him again either. When the heir returned, Kyle met him at the gates. No ceremony, no audience. "You were gone longer than expected," Kyle said. "I was learning when not to rush," the heir answered. Kyle nodded once. Later, Lyra found the heir in the archive. Her old domain, now shared. "You've changed," she said. "So have the rules," he replied. She smiled faintly. "Waiting is harder than ruling." "Yes," he said, "but it lasts longer." That was when Lyra understood. The heir was no longer a placeholder. He was becoming a stabilizer, not through obedience, not through proximity to power, but through earned restraint. And in that moment, quiet, unmarked, unnoticed by history, the line of succession finally aligned with the world it was meant to hold, not because the throne had been promised, but because the heir had learned to wait. Chapter 6. When balance becomes a threat. Balance did not announce itself with banners or proclamations. It arrived as a quiet resistance to fracture. For the first time in generations, the Dominion stopped expanding, not because it could not, but because it no longer needed to. Borders held without constant reinforcement. Trade corridors stabilized without armed escorts. Disputes were resolved before they reached blood. Power had become predictable, and predictability frightened those who thrived on unrest. Beyond the Dominion's outer ranges, beyond the treaties etched into stone and memory, other territories watched with a patience sharpened by envy. Independent pacts, regional warlords, legacy houses that had once dictated terms through fear alone. All of them sensed the same anomaly. The Alpha King was no longer volatile. The absence of volatility made him far more dangerous. In the old world, Kyle Varon's restraint had been attributed to calculation. Now it was understood as something deeper, alignment. His decisions no longer pulled against an unseen counterweight. They moved in concert with it. Lyra's return had not softened him, it had completed him. That completion altered the equation of power across the continent. The first response came disguised as diplomacy. Envoys arrived bearing gifts that felt ceremonial but smelled of testing. Rare metals, old relics, symbolic pledges meant to probe how far the Dominion would bend. Lyra received them with courtesy but not indulgence. Kyle listened. The heir observed, and somewhere in that triangle of presence offers began to collapse under their own assumptions. "We could be partners," suggested one envoy, voice smooth with practiced superiority. "Equal claimants to regional arbitration." Lyra tilted her head. "Equal in responsibility or equal in consequence?" The envoy hesitated. Kyle declined without explanation. They left with smiles that never reached their eyes. Weeks later, the pressure shifted. Disruption replaced dialogue. Caravans were intercepted near neutral zones. Border skirmishes ignited between minor pacts with histories just volatile enough to mask external manipulation. False intelligence circulated. Reports of Kyle's overreach. Rumors of Lyra's supposed covert command structure. The goal was not conquest. It was destabilization. If balance could be shaken, dominance would reassert itself naturally. The council convened under a tension that felt familiar, almost comforting, to those who remembered the old days. "Authorize preemptive strikes," one councillor urged. "Remind them why our borders are respected." Kyle did not answer immediately. Instead, he looked to the heir. "What would force you to act?" Kyle asked, before certainty. The heir considered carefully. "When delay becomes permission." Lyra smiled faintly. "Then we wait," Kyle said, "because we are not there yet." That decision unsettled allies and enemies alike. The heir was dispatched, not as a negotiator but as an observer, to the outer alliances. His task was not to fix problems, but to trace patterns. Who benefited from escalation, who lost from peace, who spoke loudly about tradition while quietly arming their borders. He found the answer in silence. The loudest provocations came from territories that were losing influence, not territory. Balance had made their old tactics obsolete. Fear no longer traveled as far as it used to. They were irrelevant, and relevance, once lost, was rarely recovered without fire. The heir returned with maps layered in probabilities instead of troop counts. "Someone is coordinating," he reported, "but not to attack us directly. They're waiting for us to look like the aggressor," Lyra said. Kyle nodded. "Because then balance fractures from within." The second response came with teeth. An ancient coalition, older than the Dominion itself, invoked legacy authority to call a conclave. Attendance was framed as mandatory. Refusal would be interpreted as admission of illegitimacy. The message was clear: submit to evaluation, or be declared unstable. The council erupted. "This is provocation," someone snapped. "A trap, yes," Lyra agreed. "Which is why we'll go." Kyle's gaze sharpened. "All of us." The conclave convened in a city designed to intimidate. Monolithic stone, narrow passages, acoustics that swallowed dissent and amplified accusation. Representatives from rival territories filled the chamber, eyes glittering with anticipation. They expected Kyle to dominate or defy. Instead, he listened. Accusations were laid out meticulously, claims of overreach dressed as stability, allegations that Lyra's influence undermined lawful hierarchy, warnings that the heir represented an untested dilution of strength. Kyle did not interrupt. When silence finally settled, Lyra rose, not to defend, to explain. She outlined the cost of volatility, on trade, on migration, on generational survival. She presented data no one else had bothered to collect, because chaos had always hidden inefficiency. She spoke of restraint not as weakness, but as sustainability. "You fear balance," she said calmly, "because it doesn't need you to fail in order to exist." The chamber stirred. Then the heir spoke, unexpectedly. "You call us unstable," he said, "because instability has been your leverage. Balance threatens your hierarchy not by force, but by removing your relevance." The accusation landed harder than a threat. The coalition fractured visibly. Some delegates left in protest, others leaned forward, not in hostility but interest. By the conclave's end, no decree was passed. But something else happened. Neutral territories began reaching out, quietly, cautiously, seeking frameworks instead of alliances, systems instead of protection. Balance was exporting itself, and that made it uncontrollable. Back in the Dominion, Lyra stood on the high terrace overlooking a city that no longer braced for impact. "They'll escalate," she said. "Yes," Kyle replied. "Because they must." The heir joined them, gaze steady. "Then the threat isn't invasion." "No," Lyra said softly. "It's imitation." The world was learning, and for those who had ruled by imbalance, learning was the most dangerous disruption of all. Because once balance proved it could endure pressure, every throne built on fear would begin to crack. Chapter 7. The War That Never Declared Itself. The escalation did not come as invasion. There were no marching armies, no banners burned, no formal declarations etched into stone. Instead, the world began to misbehave. Trade routes rerouted themselves without explanation. Neutral pacts renegotiated long-standing treaties using unfamiliar language, terms lifted directly from Dominion frameworks, imperfectly copied but unmistakable in origin. Councils elsewhere began asking questions their hierarchies could not answer without surrendering authority. Balance was spreading without permission, and those who had ruled through controlled fracture felt their grip loosening, not because they were attacked, but because they were no longer necessary. This was the war, a war of relevance. Inside the Dominion, Kyle sensed it first as resistance that did not carry hostility. Requests flooded in, not for protection, but for consultation, not for troops, but for systems. Lyra watched the patterns converge with a quiet tension that never left her shoulders. "They're not trying to destroy us," she said one night. Charts spread before her like constellations pulled too close together. "They're trying to recreate us." The heir frowned. Poorly. "Yes," Lyra agreed. "Which is why it's dangerous. Imitation without understanding bred collapse. And collapse, when blamed outward, had a way of pointing fingers at the original model. Kyle made a decision that stunned the council. He refused all external advisory requests, every one. "We will not export balance as doctrine," he said. "Only as consequence," the council protested. Allies warned of missed influence. Opportunists accused the Dominion of arrogance. Kyle remained unmoved. "Balance imposed becomes control," he continued. "Control provokes resistance. Resistance demands force." Silence followed. Lyra understood immediately. He was removing the incentive to copy, forcing others to adapt organically or fail on their own terms. The heir studied Kyle with something new in his eyes, not reverence, recognition. Meanwhile, the first collapse came from the east, a coalition that had attempted to mirror dominion restraint without dismantling its fear-based hierarchy fractured under pressure. Decisions stalled, authority blurred. Pacts revolted, not violently but logistically. Labor halted, communication slowed. They accused the dominion of sabotage. There was none, which made the accusation more frightening. Envoys arrived, angrier now, louder, demanding assistance framed as reparations. They wanted Lyra's counsel, Kyle's endorsement, the heir's legitimacy. Kyle declined. Lyra added gently, "We won't stabilize what you refuse to restructure." The envoys left with threats poorly concealed as warnings. Then came pressure from a different direction. A legacy power, the kind that did not collapse easily, made its move. Not with accusation, but with generosity. They opened their borders, funded infrastructure, offered security without demand, a mirror held up to balance, but tilted just enough to preserve dominance. The heir spotted it immediately. "They're offering choice," he said, "but only the kind that narrows over time." "Yes," Lyra replied. "Soft control." Kyle's jaw tightened. If balance could be co-opted, it could be weaponized. The legacy power extended a formal invitation to Lyra alone, advisor to advisor, balance to balance. The council objected violently. Kyle said nothing for a long time. Then, "She'll go." Lyra met his gaze. "And if they try to contain me?" "Then," Kyle said evenly, "they will learn why balance must never be mistaken for surrender." The heir watched the exchange, tension threading his spine. This was not separation born of error. This was trust sharpened by memory. Lyra traveled without guard. The legacy city received her with exquisite courtesy. No intimidation, no traps obvious enough to insult her intelligence. Their ruler, a woman older than Kyle, colder in composure, spoke openly. "You destabilize the world," the ruler said. "Not through aggression, through example." Lyra nodded. "Truth does that. We could shape it together," the ruler offered. "Guide balance, control its spread." Lyra's response was calm, final. "Balance that requires guidance is imbalance wearing manners." The ruler smiled, then attempted subtle containment anyway. Administrative delays, restricted access, carefully placed obligations. Lyra did not resist. She waited. In the Dominion, the heir felt it like pressure behind the eyes. They weren't communicating. They didn't need to. Kyle began making moves without announcement, realignments that seemed administrative until mapped together. Trade incentives shifted. Migration permissions opened. The Dominion adjusted its posture around the legacy power, quietly depriving it of leverage. The world responded. Other territories adjusted instinctively. Balance corrected itself. The legacy power released Lyra within the week. Not because of force, because containment had failed to isolate her influence. When Lyra returned, the city gates did not open ceremonially. They simply stood ready. Kyle did not embrace her. He did not need to. "You see it now," Lyra said softly as they stood overlooking a world in flux. "Yes," Kyle replied. "Balance isn't the threat." The heir joined them, expression steady. "Refusal to evolve is—" Below them, messengers arrived, not with demands, not with ultimatums, but with questions. "How do we begin?" Lyra exhaled slowly. "We don't answer," she said. Kyle nodded. "We demonstrate." And in that moment, the war that never declared itself reached its turning point, not through victory or defeat, but through inevitability. Because once the world learned that balance could not be owned, it could no longer be stopped. Chapter 8. The choice that cannot be delegated. There were decisions the council could make. There were decisions Lyra could shape. There were decisions the heir could prepare for. And then there were decisions that could not be shared. They announced themselves not with urgency but with stillness, the kind that settled after momentum ran out and left only intent behind. This was one of those moments. The Dominion had become an axis, not an empire, not a crusade, a reference point. Territories no longer asked whether the Alpha King would intervene. They asked how not to require intervention at all. Balance had altered expectations so deeply that power expressed too loudly now drew suspicion instead of loyalty. The system was working, which was exactly the problem. Systems that worked attracted dependency, and dependency, left unmanaged, transformed into abdication. Lyra recognized the pattern first. "Everyone is waiting," she said quietly, standing over the latest reports. "Not for orders, for permission to stop deciding." Kyle's jaw tightened. The air read between the lines immediately. "They're deferring risk upward." "Yes," Lyra replied, "and upward deferral always collapses onto a single point." All three of them knew what that point was. The Alpha King. If Kyle continued to absorb consequences, political, structural, moral, the world would stabilize around him instead of stabilizing itself. Balance would harden into dependency. And when Kyle eventually fell, by age, by battle, by time, the system would fracture more violently than before. Balance could not orbit a single will, not even his. The council proposed solutions that felt reasonable and were therefore dangerous. Formalize advisory councils across regions. Expand a Dominion arbitration authority. Codify Lyra's role permanently. Each suggestion strengthened the system, each one centralized it further. Kyle dismissed them all. "This is the edge," he said at last, "where structure becomes substitution." Lyra watched him carefully. "You know what must happen." "Yes," he said. "I just don't know whether the world will forgive me for it." The air felt the weight of those words like a hand closing around his spine. "What choice?" he asked. Kyle turned to him, not as ruler to successor, but as man to future. "I have to leave," Kyle said. Silence did not respond. It simply spread. Lyra did not move. The air did not breathe. "To where?" the air finally asked. "Out of the center," Kyle replied. "Out of inevitability." Lyra understood instantly, and it terrified her. "If you withdraw too far," she said carefully, "they'll interpret it as abandonment. And if I don't," Kyle countered, "they'll never learn to stand." The air's hands clenched. "You're talking about eroding your own authority." Kyle nodded once. Deliberately, this was not sacrifice. It was risk of a different order. The council would panic. Allies would accuse him of destabilization. Rivals would test borders. Old enemies would smell opportunity. And through all of it, Kyle would not intervene unless the system truly failed. He would become the constraint, not the engine. Lyra crossed the chamber slowly. "Then this choice cannot be made alone," she said. "It must be," Kyle replied gently, "or it won't work." Her eyes sharpened. "You misunderstand me. I don't mean permission." She stopped in front of him. "I mean alignment." Kyle searched her face for resistance, fear, pleading. He found none, only resolve. "You won't go silent," Lyra continued. "You won't vanish the way I did." "No," Kyle agreed. "I'll remain visible. Just inactive." The air exhaled slowly, understanding dawning with a mix of awe and dread. "You'll let them fail," he said. "Yes," Kyle replied, "where failure is survivable, and if it isn't, then," Kyle said evenly, "the system was never balanced to begin with. The announcement was not public. It unfolded as absence." Kyle stopped attending regional councils, stopped issuing corrective directives. His seal remained active but unused. Messages routed to him were acknowledged, then redirected with minimal commentary. At first it caused confusion, then frustration. Then, the most dangerous phase, panic, minor disputes escalated past their usual dampening points. Councils argued without resolution. Old habits resurfaced in places where balance had not yet sunk deep enough to hold. The heir felt pressure like never before. Requests came to him instead, not because he was ruler, because he was present. He resisted the urge to act decisively, deferred where possible, asked questions instead of issuing answers. He remembered waiting, applied it with surgical restraint. Lyra worked quietly, not as stabilizer, but as mirror. She highlighted consequences without intervening, allowed friction to teach, and Kyle watched from the periphery, from silence, from restraint sharpened into discipline. The first real failure came sooner than expected. A border alliance collapsed negotiations and armed itself reflexively. Panic rippled outward. Calls for Kyle's return erupted. He did not respond. The heir stepped into the gap, not with force but with coordination. He assembled adjacent councils, rerouted trade leverage, isolated the incentives driving escalation. It took longer. It was messier. It held. When the dust settled, something extraordinary happened. No one asked for Kyle. They asked how the heir had managed it without him. The system adapted, slowly, unevenly, painfully, but it adapted. Lyra found Kyle one evening at the edge of the city, watching lights flicker across a landscape no longer trembling at his breath. "You're fading," she said quietly. "I'm redistributing," he corrected. She studied him. "Does it hurt?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Because I finally understand how much I mattered." She nodded. "And how little you're allowed to." They stood together in silence. The heir approached later that night. "It worked," he said. "Not cleanly." But truthfully, Kyle looked at him, not assessing, not preparing, but letting go. "Then you're ready," Kyle said. "For what?" the heir asked. Kyle's expression was calm. "Certain. For the one thing balance cannot provide," he replied. "Someone who chooses." And with that, the Alpha King completed the decision no system could automate, no council could authorize, and no successor could inherit by default. He chose to step aside, not from the world, but from its center, so that when the future arrived, it would not arrive asking permission. Chapter 9. What remains? When the king steps back, the world did not collapse. That was the first and most unsettling revelation. For generations, the Dominion had been organized around a single certainty. When pressure mounted, the Alpha King would act. His presence had been the final weight on every scale, the last authority that prevented stalemate from becoming fracture. And then, Kyle Varon did not abdicate. He did not disappear. He did not announce a new age or crown a successor. He simply ceased to be the axis. What remained was not silence, it was exposure. Systems were revealed for what they truly were, not in theory but under load. Councils discovered which of their agreements were habits masquerading as principles. Alliances learned the difference between cooperation and convenience. Some regions adjusted smoothly, revealing foundations that had been stronger than anyone realized. Others cracked. The Dominion entered a phase Lyra privately named the Unsheltered Age, not because protection was gone, but because excuses were. Without Kyle's inevitability to lean on, every decision carried its full weight. Delays became visible choices. Compromise demanded accountability. Power, once buffered by hierarchy, now had consequences that landed where they were made. The heir felt it most acutely. He woke each day to decisions that could no longer be passed upward, not because Kyle refused to intervene, but because doing so would have weakened the very thing they were building. Leadership without inevitability was heavier, but it was honest. The first test came not from outside the Dominion, but within it. A council in the southern range deadlocked over water allocation, a familiar dispute, once quickly resolved by royal decree. Now it stalled for weeks, resentment hardening into identity. The heir traveled there alone. No escorts, no seals, no implied override. He sat through hours of circular argument without interrupting. He let voices rise and fall. Let frustration bloom. And then he asked one question. If no one intervenes, he said calmly, who pays the cost of delay? The answer was immediate and devastating. Everyone. Farmers, traders, border patrols, even the councillors themselves. The room went quiet. They reached resolution that night, not because they were commanded, because they could no longer outsource consequence. Word spread, not of the heir's authority, but of his refusal to become a replacement king. Lyra observed these changes with cautious relief and underlying fear. Vacuum invites ambition, she warned one evening, especially from those who believe stability is weakness. Yes, Kyle agreed, but ambition exposed early is easier to outgrow. He had taken residence beyond the citadel, close enough to remain visible, distant enough to be irrelevant in daily governance. Some called it humility, others called it strategy. Both were correct. Children grew accustomed to seeing him walk the outer paths without bowing crowds or whispered urgency. He spoke to citizens who once would have feared interrupting his stride. He listened more than he spoke, and in that listening, something unexpected happened. The myth of the Alpha King softened. He became human again. That terrified some factions far more than his power ever had. A former rival territory tested the Dominion's resolve with a calculated provocation, seizing a trade hub just outside agreed boundaries. In the past, Kyle's response would have been swift and unmistakable. Now, nothing happened. For 3 days, panic surged through old alliances. On the 4th day, a coalition of regional councils, without royal instruction, issued a unified response. Trade embargoes, rerouted labor agreements, synchronized diplomatic pressure. By the 7th day, the hub was returned. No blood, no king, no spectacle. The message was clearer than force ever could have been. Power had distributed. Kyle watched the reports arrive and felt something loosen in his chest, a tension he hadn't known he still carried. Lyra noticed. "You're not needed," she said gently. "No," Kyle replied, "and that's the first time I've trusted the future." Yet not all consequences were clean. Some leaders, raised on dominance, resented the loss of absolution. Without a king to defy or obey, their own failures stood naked. They whispered that the Dominion had grown weak, indecisive, overcomplicated. A small but vocal bloc began advocating for restoration, not of Kyle specifically, of certainty. The heir encountered them in corridors and councils, voices that pushed for consolidation, emergency powers, clearer chains of command. Stability requires authority, one argued. Yes, the heir replied evenly, but authority that cannot step back is already unstable. They underestimated him. That was their mistake. The heir did not confront the movement directly. He let it surface. He required its proponents to formalize proposals, to map outcomes, to account publicly for risks. Under scrutiny, their rhetoric thinned. What remained was fear, of complexity, of shared responsibility, of a world that could not be dominated into obedience. The movement dissolved, not defeated, but understood. Lyra watched this with a quiet pride she did not try to hide. "You're doing what Kyle never could," she told the heir. He frowned slightly. Because he was stronger? No, she corrected. Because he was necessary. The difference mattered. As seasons passed, the dominion changed texture. Not softer, not weaker, more articulate. Disputes grew shorter. Cooperation grew slower, but deeper. External territories no longer sought alignment through proximity to Kyle, but through compatibility with the system itself. Balance had stopped being remarkable. It had become normal, and that, paradoxically, made it resilient. One evening, as the city settled into an ordinary calm that once would have felt unimaginable, Kyle stood with Lyra at the edge of the outer wall. "Do you regret it?" she asked. He didn't answer immediately. "I regret believing the world needed me," he said finally, "more than it needed to learn." She nodded. "You did both." Below them, the air crossed the courtyard. Unhurried, focused, unremarkable in the best possible way. The future did not bend around him. It walked beside him, and in that quiet symmetry, no king at the center, no chaos at the edge, the dominion discovered what remained when power loosened its grip, not absence, not loss, but a world that no longer needed to be held together by one pair of hands. Chapter 10. The Day the World Stops Watching. It happened without announcement. No turning of seasons marked it. No ceremony or decree drew a line between before and after. The world simply looked elsewhere. For generations, eyes had tracked the dominion with a vigilance sharpened by fear or ambition. Every decision Kyle Varon made had once sent ripples outward, prompting recalculations, countermoves, quiet panic. Even after he stepped back, the habit remained. At first, observers watched for signs of fracture, for proof that balance without a center would fail. Analysts in distant territories mapped dominion choices, searching for the missing hand on the scale, and then, slowly, they stopped. Not because interest faded, but because there was nothing exceptional left to predict. The dominion had become boring in the most dangerous way imaginable. Predictable responses, distributed decisions, no spectacular collapses, no dramatic rescues, nothing to exploit. The heir noticed it first through absence. Reports that once arrived hourly thinned to daily summaries. External envoys delayed visits, not out of hostility, but irrelevance. The dominion no longer distorted neighboring strategies by its mere existence. It had normalized. "You've vanished," one foreign delegate remarked during a routine visit, half joking. "We used to plan entire seasons around you." The heir smiled politely. "That sounds exhausting." It was meant as humor. It was also truth. Lyra watched the shift with a mixture of relief and unease. Invisibility is success, she reminded herself. Until it isn't, balance required maintenance, not intervention, but awareness. Systems that worked unattended could still calcify if attention drifted entirely, yet what she saw was not stagnation. It was motion without spectacle. Communities adapted in small, iterative ways. Councils refined processes. Conflicts resolved at their source instead of climbing hierarchies. Power moved laterally, not upward. The world stopped watching because there was no longer a single place to aim its gaze. Kyle felt it most personally. He could walk the outer districts without whispers trailing him. Children knew him as a tall man who listened well, not as the story that shaped their parents' lives. Merchants spoke to him plainly. Elders debated him without reverence. He was not diminished. He was contextualized. One afternoon, he sat beside Lyra beneath an old cedar overlooking the valley. "They're not afraid anymore," he said quietly. "No," Lyra replied. "They're competent." He considered that. "Is that what we wanted?" Lyra met his gaze. It's what lasts. The Heir joined them later, carrying a thin slate. Routine updates, nothing urgent. "We've finalized the regional autonomy review," he said. "No objections strong enough to escalate." Kyle raised an eyebrow. "No objections at all." "Plenty," the Heir answered. "Just none that required saving from themselves." Kyle nodded, satisfied. There was a strange grief in that satisfaction, a letting go so complete it no longer asked to be witnessed. That night, a small incident occurred that would have once drawn immediate attention. A cross-border disagreement over transit rights flared briefly. In the old world, this would have triggered urgent councils, posturing, perhaps even troop movement. Instead, local representatives convened, referenced existing frameworks, adjusted terms, and issued a joint statement within hours. No one outside the region noticed. And that was the moment. Not when peace was declared, not when power shifted, but when resolution no longer needed an audience. Lyra recorded the event privately. "The world has stopped watching us," she wrote, "which means we no longer define it, only participate." Some would have called that decline. She knew better. In distant territories, new conflicts rose and fell without reference to the Dominion. Old powers tested each other. New balances formed, some crude, some promising. None of them waited for Kyle. None of them asked for Lyra. None of them measured themselves against the Heir. The Dominion had ceased to be a mirror. It had become background, and in background, life continued. Years passed, not dramatically but steadily. The Heir grew into a leader whose authority was rarely announced and often unnoticed. When he eventually assumed formal leadership, it was met not with celebration but with nods, acceptance born of familiarity. Kyle did not attend the ceremony. He was walking the outer paths. Lyra stood at the edge of the crowd, watching not a coronation but a continuation. When it ended, there was no cheer loud enough to carry beyond the city. That night, the stars were sharp and indifferent. Kyle and Lyra stood together once more, older now, quieter. "So," Kyle said, "this is it." Lyra smiled faintly. "This is what we protected." He looked out over a world that no longer needed him to hold its breath. "No one's watching," he said. Lyra nodded. "Which means it's finally alive, and somewhere far beyond the Dominion, where balance had been copied, misunderstood, adapted, and remade, the world moved on without pause. Not because power had vanished, but because it had learned how not to insist on being seen. Epilogue. After power learns silence, power did not disappear. It learned to sit down. Years after the world stopped watching, there were still moments when the old gravity returned, not as fear but as memory. A pause in conversation when Kyle entered a room. A flicker of recognition in the eyes of elders who had once measured history by his decisions. But those moments passed quickly now. They had learned, as he had, that reverence was not required for stability. Kyle lived near the northern edge of the Dominion, in a structure that would never be mistaken for a seat of rule. Stone, wood, weather-worn. He woke early. He listened more than he spoke. When disputes found him, he redirected them, not upward but outward, back to where responsibility belonged. Some called it humility. Kyle knew better. It was accuracy. Lyra moved differently through the world. Where she had once vanished to survive, she now appeared by choice. Not often, not loudly, but with intention. She traveled between regions, not as an envoy or authority, but as a calibrator, observing where systems leaned too far, where silence risked becoming neglect. She did not correct them herself. She asked questions that refused to be ignored. In some places they never learned her name. That was fine. Balance rarely needed attribution. The Heir, no longer called that, stood at the center of a structure that barely acknowledged him. Leadership had become procedural, distributed, and almost irritatingly mundane. He signed fewer decrees than any ruler before him. He spent more time listening to summaries that contained no emergencies. His greatest challenge was patience. And that, he had learned, was the point. One evening, long after titles had softened into roles, the three of them stood together again, by coincidence, not ceremony. The valley below was quiet, not peaceful, quiet in the way functioning things are quiet. Kyle broke the silence first. "We used to think the world would end if I let go." Lyra smiled faintly. "You thought the world would end if you weren't holding it." He didn't argue. "I didn't know how much noise power made until it stopped," he said. The former heir nodded. "That noise was useful once. But it was also a warning." "A warning of what?" Kyle asked. "That something was carrying more weight than it should." They stood with that truth between them, unchallenged. Later that night, Lyra wrote one last entry in a journal she had kept since her disappearance. "Power does not want to be shared," she wrote. "It wants to be trusted. When it isn't, it grows louder. When it is, it fades into structure." She closed the journal. She did not preserve it. Some knowledge did not need to survive beyond its use. In distant lands, new rulers rose, some loud, some quiet. Some would repeat old mistakes. Others would stumble towards something closer to balance without ever knowing why it felt right. None of them would trace the line back here. And that was the final proof. Not that Kyle had ruled well, not that Lyra had anchored him, not even that the Dominion had endured, but that the world no longer needed a legend to function. Power had learned silence, and in that silence, life did not end. It continued.